All right, everybody, welcome back for another deep dive. Sometimes you think international diplomacy is all about, those carefully worded statements, those big strategies, and then sometimes it's much more blunt, like a plane just being told, no, you can't land here.
Right, exactly. Like a huge no-fly zone for diplomacy.
Yeah. So that's what we're going to look at today,
Yeah.
the situation with the U.S. and Colombia, and Colombia reportedly just saying no to deportation flights from the U.S. And this is during a time when the Trump administration's really been pushing for more, migrant raids and getting these deportation flights organized. So they probably expected, things to go maybe a bit smoother.
Yeah, that expectation element is huge here, I think. And the source that we're looking at today is from the Ring of Fire on YouTube, their video called Trump Loses IT After Country Turns Away His Deportation Flights. And they really highlight Colombia's reaction as like a statement about their own sovereignty, saying we are a separate country. We decide who gets to come in here. And that includes people being deported from somewhere else.
Yeah, it's like a big, bold statement.
Exactly.
And the U.S. response was pretty quick, according to the source. So Donald Trump goes on Truth Social and announces what he calls these emergency tariffs, 25% on goods coming from Colombia.
Wow.
And he doesn't start there. So he also says there's going to be travel restrictions and financial sanctions as well.
So a whole bunch of retaliatory measures all at once.
Exactly.
And in terms of the bigger picture, this kind of sets a certain tone in terms of international relations, and it makes you wonder, how other countries are looking at this, what they're thinking.
Yeah, because the justification that Trump gives is that Colombia is breaking its legal obligations by not taking back these people who he calls criminals that they forced into the United States.
Right. And so there's this interesting use of language there, criminals.
Right. And that's a point the source brings up right away, is that for a lot of these folks, the only thing they did, quote unquote, wrong was crossing the border illegally, which in the U.S., a lot of times that's a misdemeanor, not a felony.
Exactly.
So to call them criminals, is that really the right way to frame it?
Yeah, it seems like kind of a loaded term in that situation.
Yeah, very loaded. And so the source really dives into that. Is that accurate to say criminal? And then also goes back to this idea of Colombia saying no. And they really hammer home the fact that Colombia as a sovereign nation doesn't have to just accept these flights.
Right, it's their choice.
Yeah, they get to decide who comes into their country.
Exactly.
That seems like a pretty basic international law principle.
Yeah, national sovereignty, like that's the whole idea. Every country gets to decide who is on their land.
Right, unless there's some specific agreement, that says otherwise.
Yeah, some kind of treaty or something.
Exactly. So, so then the source shifts gears a little bit to talk about the economics of this whole thing, because these tariffs, 25%, that's a big deal.
Oh, yeah.
And they go into the trade relationship between the U.S. and Colombia, which is kind of interesting because for a while, the U.S. had what's called a trade surplus, meaning we were selling them more stuff than they were selling us.
Oh, okay.
But here's where it gets kind of wild. That's flipped.
What?
Yeah, now the U.S. has a trade deficit with Colombia.
Really?
Yeah, we're buying more from them than they are from us.
So what does that mean for these tariffs then?
Well, that's exactly the point the source makes, is that if these tariffs happen, it's probably going to be us, the people in the U.S., who feel it the most.
How so?
Well, think about it. Those tariffs, they get added to the price of goods coming from Colombia. So stuff like coffee, certain fruits, anything we get from Colombia could get more expensive or harder to find.
Oh, I see. So it's not like Colombia's paying that 25% we are.
Yeah, the source really emphasizes that it's like, maybe this isn't as much of a punishment for Colombia as some people think it is.
Right. So maybe there are other reasons for this decision.
Yeah.
Beyond just pure economics.
Yeah, and that kind of gets to a bigger point that the source makes, which is, there's this concern about the U.S. government almost being used as a weapon against people who don't agree with it. Really?
Yeah, not just domestically, but also, like in this case, internationally.
Oh, wow.
So using these economic tools like tariffs to kind of strong arm other countries.
And that could have some implications down the line, right?
Absolutely.
Like, how does this affect our relationships with other countries in the future,
Exactly. It's not just about, what happens right now with Colombia, but it's like, how does the rest of the world see this?
Does this make other countries less likely to work with us or trust us?
Exactly.
Down the line?
Right. And it's not like this is happening in a vacuum either, because the source also mentions some other things that have been going on with the Trump administration. They talk about this executive order that's supposedly based on some messed up science, legally declared everybody in the U.S. as a woman.
Wait, what?
Yeah, no, it sounds crazy, right?
So, like, legally, everybody's a woman
Well,
now.
according to this executive order, yeah.
That's wild.
And then they mention other orders that have been like thrown out by the courts because they were just not legal. So it's like a pattern of questionable decisions.
Yeah, and that kind of feeds into this whole idea of, other countries like Colombia saying, wait a minute, we don't have to just do what you say. We have our own laws, our own rights.
Right. We're not going to be bullied.
Exactly. And so that's kind of the big takeaway here is you've got this situation with Colombia saying no to these deportation flights, the U.S. firing back with these tariffs and other measures. And it really boils down to these big questions of, what does it mean to be a sovereign nation?
Right. And how do countries interact with each other when they don't agree on something?
Right. And then there's this whole layer of economics on top of it. Who's really going to feel the pain from these tariffs?
And what message does all of this send to the rest of the world? Are we trying to work with other countries, or are we just trying to tell them what to do?
Right. And that brings us to the big question that we want you to think about as we wrap things up here. Given all this complexity with countries being independent and also relying on each other economically, what do you think the long-term consequences of these really aggressive diplomatic tactics are going to be?
Yeah, it's something to really consider.
Absolutely. So we encourage you to dig deeper into all of this, look
Yeah.
into international law trade relationships and what it really means for a country to have obligations on the world stage.
Because these aren't just abstract ideas. They affect all of us.
They really do. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
See you next time.
See ya.